Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Why, hello, friends. We'll be following in the footsteps of another empress later this month. But first, we're joined by historian Elizabeth Norton, who's here to talk about her fantastic book, Women Who Ruled the World: 500 Years of Female Monarchy. Come along with us as we talk about some of history's most compelling female monarchs, both their challenges and triumphs, and how history grapples with women in power. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queens, Gail, Olivia, and Rashida. My warrior queens, Alexis, Amanda, MCF, Amy, Kate, Ika, Jessie, June, Neve and Sloan, and Sarah. My imperial empresses, Alyssa, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Letitia, Sally, Samara, and Teresa. And my lady pharaohs, Bridget, the fabulous Courtneys, Kot, Kate, Kimberly, Laura, Lori, and Sophie. Patrons are a huge part of what keeps this show running. They get every episode early and ad-free. They also get exclusive bonus episodes, including the video version of my chat with Elizabeth. To find out all about it, just click on the link in my show notes. Hello, Elizabeth, and welcome back to the Exploress.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So can you kick us off by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, so I am Dr. Elizabeth Norton. I'm a historian, a British historian, and I primarily write about queenship and also the Tudor period, although my new book, Women Who Ruled the World: 5,000 Years of Female Monarchy, takes me well beyond the Tudor period.
Yes, so listeners will know you from our Tudor series. You were one of our very excellent Tudor experts, and you have written extensively on the Tudor period, as you said, and about women's lives during that era. So a lot of your work to date has been very grounded in English history. So what is it that inspired you and made you want to write about women in power more globally and to take that on as a subject?
Yeah, so I wanted to look at reigning queens or female kings, and both terms are valid. I've had some kind of blowback online. People say female kings, that's ridiculous. But, tell that to Maria Theresa, who is queen of Hungary, female king of Hungary, or Tamar of Georgia, who's female king of Georgia, for example. But, actually, in Britain, we've had some really powerful reigning queens. I mean, of course, Elizabeth I, Mary I, Queen. I personally have a bit of a soft spot for Queen Anne. I like Queen Anne. Victoria, Elizabeth II, amongst others. But actually, if you want to look at reigning queenship, you can't really just stick to one country because it's global. And actually, as far as we can tell, as far as records allow, the earliest reigning queens are African, Egypt, and then Sudan and modern day Ethiopia. So you actually have to go global, I think. And actually, I think it's really valid to do that because we are a patriarchal species, almost universally, in fact. So actually, a lot of the pressures that affect women rulers or women attempting to rule in their own right affects them globally and across time, really at least until about the 1950s. So actually, you do have to go broad. If you just stick with one area, if you just stick with Britain or if you just stick with Europe, you're really not telling the full story.
And when we glance back at history and we're talking about kingship and about rulership and power, we often think of men first. But you look through history and there were so many women, as you say, in positions of power all across time, all across the world. And because we are a patriarchal species, they were often kind of going against the grain. They were having to kind of sometimes contort themselves to fit into these roles that at least it was viewed as it wasn't natural for them to be in them. But there were plenty of female rulers. So your book is really ambitious. It's tackling pretty much all of human history, and we're going all across the world to different civilizations and different times. So I'm curious to know, how did you go about choosing your subjects and who you would include in the book and who you would leave out?
Yeah, so as a kind of absolute basic starting point, I defined reigning queen. And actually, it's become apparent that, people don't necessarily understand what it means or have different ideas. And I think partly that's to do with English doesn't really have a word for reigning queen. It's just queen, which of course also means a consort. Elizabeth II was Queen of Britain, but so is Camilla. But they're very, very different in their role and in, you know, how they approach the role. Firstly, I kind of define it. And this is not to say that there aren't powerful women who aren't reigning queens, because there absolutely are. Eleanor of Aquitaine is a queen consort who's very, very powerful. There are many very powerful consorts, regents, dowagers who didn't make the cut, because actually what I wanted to look at particularly were effectively, I mean, I always say it's kind of the people who are the face on the coin. You know, that's a slight fudge because obviously, you know, sometimes consorts make it onto coins, but it's effectively the head of state. So if, you know, it's the woman who's reigning in her own right, who's the one who is the name on the charters. So not ruling through a son or a husband, or, you know, they don't have a man to hide behind. So that was really the starting point. And then I had to choose, because there are lots of them. You know, there have never been as many as men by a huge margin. You know, it's women tend to be a last resort. But there almost always is a reigning queen somewhere in the world. And I think that's worth bringing out. So there are some I really wanted to fit in and I didn't have room to feature. So how the book sets out is I feature specific queens in chapters, and other queens are kind of mentioned and appear, but don't have so much of a feature. From my point of view, the most obvious omission is Mary I of England. I would have liked to have included her as a featured queen. The reason I didn't is that actually I didn't want to have too many British examples. And obviously Matilda's in there, Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots, Victoria, Elizabeth II. And actually, I would have liked to have had Mary in, but the themes I would have looked at with her, I think I could do with her grandmother, Isabel of Castile, for example. And it's not in any way a comment on Mary. I think she's really fascinating. I also think a lot of really good work's been done on Mary in recent years by historians, really good work. So I kind of almost felt she didn't really need kind of extra attention, but she could have been in there. So I basically picked out themes that I thought were important, and then looked at women across the world to try and, you know, sort of see who fitted in this theme, who didn't fit in this theme. And, you know, there are some quite startling combinations. Possession of China is in there with Elizabeth I in the same chapter, for example, looking at kind of successful and powerful queenship, looking at propaganda, for example. And some people hate the structure. Hopefully most people like it. I like it. I think it's good to do the comparisons. But, you know, obviously
I
there are
love it.
often big gaps in time. Yeah, I think it's quite good fun. And it does bring out the similarities. You know, Wu is a 7th century, she's the only female Chinese head of state, 7th century empress, well, really emperor. And actually, the way she uses propaganda to kind of almost turn being female into an advantage when it's a huge disadvantage is very similar to Elizabeth I, you know, nearly 1,000 years later. And I think that's worth bringing out, actually.
Yeah, and I love the way you structured your chapters, as you say, organized by theme. So you are bringing together women who have probably never been on the same page before in any other book. And it does mean that they come into conversation with each other in really interesting ways. And when you're talking about, say, someone like Elizabeth I, who there's been a lot of work done on Elizabeth I, she's very famous. We all know her name, but it lets you look at her from a different angle than we may have seen her before. And it is fascinating to see these women from different times and places who all found themselves in similar positions of power coming into conversation with each other, and kind of what they had to do to get there, to hang on to power. What were their challenges? What were their triumphs? I really liked it. I think it's a really original and interesting way of bringing these women together.
Yeah, no, I like it. And I love that you picked out the conversation, because I think it's absolutely that. It's, you know, we know a lot about Elizabeth I, but actually we don't necessarily situate her within global queenship or, you know, and across history, really, because these same issues come around again and again and again, because actually almost nowhere, I mean, there's kind of two polities that I've come across in the world that seem to welcome queens. Otherwise, almost nowhere really wants a queen. Most places, France accepted, will take a queen if there's no other option. And that's why
If we
queens
must.
tend to come again. Yeah, absolutely. So it's like, well, I suppose they'll do. And you can see that with the Tudors, of course. You know, I mean, they run out of men. So then they crown Mary and then they crown Elizabeth. It's interesting to compare them because the issues are really similar. There's always a sense, you know, can women do it? Can they rule? I mean, even Queen Victoria faced that when she came to the throne. There were concerns about her competence. Even Elizabeth II to some extent. And of course, Margaretha II of Denmark, who abdicated a couple of years ago, became queen in 1972. She was a teenager before she even had a place in the line of succession because they didn't have women. So even in the 20th century, women tend to be a bit sort of, no one really wanted one.
Well, you spent so much time researching these women and bringing them together and kind of looking at them thematically. So, in the course of writing the book, were there certain storylines, story arcs that you found repeating over and over? Were there kind of like, did you walk away from the research and the writing coming to any conclusions about the history of queenship and female power?
Yeah. I mean, and it's slightly depressing. The main one is male relatives are a real problem for reigning queens. And obviously, firstly, of course, if they have a claim to the throne, they're likely to take the throne before the woman anyway. But, actually, even male relatives who don't have a claim to the throne can be a real issue. Again, the Tudor reigning queens are really lucky that they don't have close male relatives. I mean, I think they may well have found it very difficult to even become queens if there had been, if Jane Grey had been John Grey, for example, Mary may well have really struggled to take the throne. Male relatives are a problem. Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the famous Cleopatra, she's never able to rule by herself. She always has to have a male on the throne. And she is the dominant party, but she's never able to entirely kind of do away with this kind of male influence. And I mean, her reign's ultimately a failure, of course, which I think isn't always brought out in, our depictions of her because she's got this kind of romanticized gloss, but she does struggle to assert her authority. In the book, I have two 15th century examples that I think really demonstrate this well. There's Charlotte of Cyprus, who is the only legitimate child of the King of Cyprus, becomes queen. Firstly, she has a husband who's awful, and they kind of vie for power. They mint their own coins independently of each other, without reference to each other at all.
Wow.
So he's a bit of a nightmare. But she also has an illegitimate half-brother who's a real problem for her because, of course, in the Christian tradition, of course, legitimacy is a big thing. It's a big deal. But Cyprus is a vassal state of the Mamluk sultans in Cairo. So Jacques, her brother, takes himself off to Cairo and basically says to the sultan, can't I be king of Cyprus? And, from an Islamic point of view, it's simply a competition between the son and the daughter of the previous king. So, of course, you're going to go with the boy. And, of course, he does. Charlotte then takes herself off to the Pope after Jacques has basically conquered Cyprus. And, and the Pope, and we've got this wonderful account of the interview because the Pope wrote his autobiography, and he spends a lot of time talking about her appearance and how attractive he finds her before basically saying, I'm pretty sure it's God's judgment that you've lost Cyprus because your father-in-law was really rude to me last time I saw him. So again, she's still got these male relatives being a real issue for her. So, she loses her throne. And really, really good example is Blanca II of Navarre. So the small sort of Spanish kingdom in between Spain and France. Her mother had been reigning queen. Her father, Juan II of Aragon, is the king consort, and he doesn't want to give up power. So he actually imprisons Blanca and quite likely has her murdered in 1464. She certainly dies under suspicious circumstances because he doesn't want to give up the power. And then her sister Leonor, who's the next in line, has to wait until he dies and then gets crowned and then drops dead 2 weeks later. Male relatives are a real issue for reigning queens. There are other themes that kind of come up and repeat time and again. But I mean, it's important to note reigning queens are not all kind of passive victims. Some are, but many of them are not. Catherine the Great, for example. But there are so many themes that just come up again. But male relatives are a real issue.
And I loved in the book that you brought out Arsinoe, so Cleopatra VII's sister, who also we don't often talk about. But she was, one of the many siblings of Ptolemy. I think it was Ptolemy the 12th, wasn't it? If I'm remembering my numerals correctly, their father. And she actually leads a rebellion and tries to get rid of Cleopatra and assume the throne herself. And it doesn't go well. But I just think it's fascinating that, we talk about Cleopatra, we talk about the Roman men, we talk a little bit about her brothers who she has to marry to stay in power. But why don't we talk about Arsinoe? It's like this whole wild episode where sister goes up against sister to try to claim power.
It's baffling, actually, because it's such an interesting story. And, for a moment, there's kind of two queens in Alexandria. And, she gets spirited off to Rome and she walks in one of their triumphal processions, to kind of display her as a victim, as a vanquished enemy. And actually, the crowds are just very sympathetic, surprisingly so, because she looks so young and so innocent and, sweet. I mean, she's a Ptolemy, so she probably isn't that sweet, to be honest.
Probably not.
No, probably not. But she ends up being sent to Ephesus, where she's kind of almost, effectively a prisoner, kind of a hostage, and eventually gets murdered by Mark Antony, probably on Cleopatra's orders. But it's a fascinating story, and one that isn't often told because she gets so overshadowed by Cleopatra.
Yes, we already have one woman in charge who's sleeping with Roman generals and causing trouble. Let's not muddy the waters by introducing another power-hungry woman. Yeah, it is fascinating. It's like these narratives that we give to women, and certainly women who want to rule.
Yeah, I mean, people very much give them labels, and you can see that with Cleopatra, who, actually, later depictions of Cleopatra almost always have her in see-through clothes or often a bit naked, which is, it's kind of, it's very
Why?
much, yeah, why?
Why? Yeah, and when you talk about bad men and about women and I always think about Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. I mean, Mary, Queen of Scots is, of all the women in your book, she's definitely one of the ones who was just so most firmly born into power, has the right to rule from the cradle, becomes the Queen of France, is the Queen of Scotland, is a threat. One could argue has a lot more claim to the English throne than Elizabeth I, but she has all the problems with men, all the problems. The men she marries, the men she's related to, eventually her son, just so many man problems. Whereas Elizabeth I was like, I don't want any man problems, so I'm not going to get married and I'm not going to have any children. And that was, it's more complicated than all that. But it is really interesting how, you put those two women together and they were very much parallel during their time. And it's like both these women were labeled, both these women had trouble with men, and both of them dealt with it in very different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's, the two queens in one aisle kind of almost invite comparison. But yeah, the saddest thing about Mary's story, I think, is actually the absolute worst thing she could do is give birth to James. And that sounds awful, but it's true. Because once there's a prince, nobody, actually, most countries will choose a baby boy over an adult woman. And Scotland was no exception there, really. Once there's a prince, they kind of don't need her anymore. She's created her own rival. And he's a much bigger rival than Lord Darnley was, her second husband, and that's kind of really sad. Elizabeth I, by deciding not to marry, is incredibly selfish. That destroys the dynasty. It causes no end of political instability, at least in the early years of her reign. But actually, from Elizabeth's point of view, it's absolutely the right choice because you can't remove her if there isn't anybody else, of course.
Yeah, that's it. And because of that, she reigns for an incredibly long time, but it comes at a price.
Yeah, it does. And of course, the Tudor dynasty ends. She was lucky, and England was lucky, that actually James's succession was so smooth. Because had she died, 20 years earlier, there may well have been, had she died while Mary was still alive, Mary Queen of Scots, there would have been no end of problems, I think.
Well, while we're talking about women and labels and how we look at women in power, I'm wanting to take us back to ancient history and more specifically the Bible. So you tell us a little bit in the book about two of the kind of iconic women in the Bible, Jezebel and Athaliah, and how men have used some of the ruling women in the Bible to rail against other women in positions of power ever since.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pre-modern Christians were hugely well-versed on the Bible, and I think that's really worth bringing out. So I bring out the biblical queens actually in the chapter on Mary, Queen of Scots, because they were very much used as precedents to justify Mary's fall, her imprisonment, her ultimate execution, because people were looking for precedents. And of course, John Knox does it. In his monstrous regiment of women. He very much compares Mary I and Mary of Guise, Mary Queen of Scots' mother, to particularly Jezebel. Athaliah comes up as well. So Athaliah is the only reigning queen in the Old Testament. Jezebel's probably her mother. If she's not her mother, then she's a sister-in-law or a stepmother, but close relative who probably brings her up. And I mean, Jezebel just gets such bad press, and I quote this in the book. There's a very serious biblical scholar in the 20th century compares her to Adolf Hitler in her infamy. In the Bible, she does, when you look at how many people she's actually killed, it's really not in the millions. It's kind of, a kind of 5 or so, if that. And it's just this relentlessly bad press this woman gets. The Bible can be quite misogynistic at times, particularly the Old Testament. I think most people would probably agree with that. This is not a criticism. I mean, it's difficult to pick the history out of the Bible from, of course, theology. There is some independent attestation for Jezebel. There's a seal that survives in a museum in Jerusalem, which is possibly hers, has her name on it. And certainly some of the men in her life, there is independent attestation. So she probably did exist. But she's just, Jezebel in English means, immoral woman. We talk about someone being a Jezebel. So it's so interesting that this has continued. And Atalia is less well known. She's the queen of Judah. She takes over after her son's murder, not by her, by a conqueror who conquers Israel and murders her son while he's in Israel. And she eventually gets murdered by some of her priests and other kind of ministers in her court because they want to put her grandson on the throne. But she very much gets blamed for her own death, which is kind of interesting, I think. And Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, gets blamed for her own death to quite a large extent. But it is really interesting to see the way these women are raised as a justification. I mean, the English Parliament compares Mary to Atalia and basically says, well, she was put to death and it's in the Bible. So there's precedent for putting to death a reigning queen.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And in all the research I've done in different periods of history, I have seen a woman who was causing trouble in some way or another called a Jezebel in the sources so many times through so many centuries. It was like the unfortunate PR label that would just never die.
Yeah, absolutely. She's not portrayed positively in the books of Kings at all, but she's not the worst. It is a thing that women are held to higher standards. And another really good example is Bloody Mary. And Mary the First did burn Protestants. She burns just under 300 during a kind of a 4-year period, which is not a good record. But her father, Henry VIII, on a very conservative estimate, kills 30,000 of his subjects during his reign. And he's not Bloody Henry. So,
No.
women
including some of his wives. So,
yes,
interesting.
including some of his wives and other close family members and friends and teachers and kind of, people he knew.
The double standards.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about one of my very favorite subjects to talk about, which is warrior queens. Specifically, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the Kingdom of Kush and its, I feel I'm going to mispronounce this, Kandakes.
Perfect.
What can you tell us about them? Oh, thank you. Good.
Yeah, so these are fascinating. So earlier when I said, most areas don't actively seek out queens, this is one area that does, which is really interesting. I mean, it could really be considered a queendom, I think. So Kush it's in modern day Sudan and also northern Ethiopia. The Queen of Sheba is probably a Kandake, for example. And Kandake originally kind of means queen mother, and the queen mothers were really powerful. And by kind of the first millennium BCE and then into the first millennium CE, actually the Kandakes become the ruler. So they actually do have effectively a dynasty of reigning women. And we only view them through other people's eyes. Unfortunately, Meroitic script, which is the script that they write with, hasn't been deciphered yet. Someone needs to work on that. AI must be able to do it. But, so we're looking at them through other people's eyes, particularly sort of Roman sources, earlier Egyptian sources. So we can't read their own inscriptions, which is frustrating. But they famously have, if you drive out of modern Khartoum, and I think, Khartoum's not on most people's visit list at the moment, but, actually, if you go to Meroe, the remains of Meroe, which was their capital, you see these really tall, kind of pointy pyramids. They're square, but they look like sort of square witches' hats. And a lot of those are for Kandakes. And you can see these sort of powerful women in their, in their depictions. And they're often depicted as quite large women. They're fascinating figures. They look mighty, which is really interesting, I think. And, very much there's no kind of Egyptian gloss, where women are kind of sort of lithe and, they're wearing their wigs and, they're all kind of standard. They're very kind of mighty warrior-esque figures, and they very much are warriors, the Kandakes. They're expected to fight and to go into battle and to lead their troops, which is really unusual. And there are some really fascinating ones. There's one who actually takes advantage of a Roman governor's absence to kind of lead her troops up northwards into North Africa, and does some really remarkable things, conquers some cities, actually decapitate statues. They find a head of one of the Roman emperors underneath a doorway where clearly it's been stomped on by people. And she's ultimately not successful. She's conquered by the Romans, but actually because of that, they actually don't go Rome doesn't go further into Africa. They sort of think, we'll draw a line here. So she actually almost sets the border, but they are a remarkable dynasty. And I wish we knew more about them individually, because they're fascinating. And the idea that they do switch to queenship is really rare. The only other polity that I've come across, and I've done quite a lot of research into it, that welcomes queens in a similar way is the reign queens of the Balabeda in South Africa. Although actually, they're recognised as a queendom in South Africa's constitution. Although actually they tried to crown a king recently, and it's all going through the constitutional court. So even there, a queendom may end up with a king.
I don't love to hear that.
No, me neither.
We've had enough kings. We don't need any more. And I like that you talk about Zenobia as well, who we've spoken about on the show before. I think, we're really fascinated by warrior women, and specifically like reigning warrior queens, because they are the point you make in that chapter, which I thought was really interesting, is that kings are expected to be warriors pretty much across the board. It's part of the job description. But women are not expected to be warriors. And in fact, a woman fighting is often considered, unnatural or something to be feared. Certainly we know the ancient Romans didn't love it. The way they talk about warrior women, it's as if they're like this alien species. But in order for a woman to rule, she needs to be able to inhabit that warrior space too. So it's a difficult thing that she has to break through kind of two barriers at once. But Zenobia is another fantastic example of a woman who took charge and really was able to achieve an awful lot.
Yeah. She conquers Egypt, which is pretty
no
impressive.
big deal. She just goes ahead, and takes advantage of the ancient Romans kind of not paying as much attention as they should, and just says, I think I'll take this. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's a real sense that it's humiliating to be beaten by a woman. The emperor has to justify and basically kind of almost bigs up Zenobia in the Senate, saying, well, you would understand that I got defeated by this woman if you knew what sort of woman she was like, and it's this sense that she's a really special woman, and that's why he was defeated by her, which is, interesting. And you see that again, Marguerite the First, and she's not in. Marguerite's not in the Warrior Queens chapter. She could have been. Marguerite the First of Denmark and Norway conquers Sweden, and there's a real sense that it's extra humiliating for the King of Sweden that Marguerite he's defeated by a woman. It's just extra bad because you should be able to beat a woman. But it is such, as you say, it's such a fascinating balance, because at least before the modern era, folks have to be warriors. That's part of the job description. But most women won't have had the training. And actually, most women we think of as warrior queens don't necessarily go into battle themselves. They kind of construct themselves in other ways. Elizabeth I at Tilbury is a really good example, where she addresses the troops. She wasn't planning to fight herself. But women often ride with their armies. They deal in the logistics. They're present at the edge of the battlefield. Isabel of Castile is a really good example of that. And it's Isabel, actually. Isabel takes the throne of Castile in the 15th century from her niece during the War of the Castilian Succession. And actually, it's Ferdinand, her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, who actually fights in the war's only pitched battle. But it's very much Isabel who kind of has the reputation as a warrior. So I think people are quite open to this idea. We're not quite in the regions of sort of, the idea of this barbarian queen with the breastplate bikini, which you get in kind of modern computer games. But there's certainly a sense that people quite like the idea of women as warriors. Kind of it's almost, women often get portrayed quite stereotypically. Often they're kind of, Virgin Mary-esque figures, but also the idea of the warrior queen people quite like. And so it's possible to play into that as a pre-modern reigning queen, and they often do.
So in the history of female rulers, we see a lot, as you said, we see a lot of consorts, we see a lot of queen regnants. I got into trouble with someone was reviewing the show once, and they got mad at me because I kept saying queen regnant, and they thought I was mispronouncing regent. And so I had to explain how a regnant and a regent were different. But anyway, so
Yes.
we have
Yes.
women
It's
coming to
English.
power.
It's
Yeah,
English that is the problem. We need more words.
listen. And I never leave comments on other people's comments. You're allowed to have your comments about, my show, whether you like it or don't. But I had to respond to that one because I was like, no, no, no. I was great.
Yes.
But look, we see women come to power in a lot of different ways. But at least from my research, it seems like a lot of women, they don't necessarily have clear hereditary claims to the throne, or when they do, they really have to fight to claim it. So I'm hoping that you can tell us, since we're in the middle of doing a series about a couple of empresses, I hope you'll tell us a little bit about Empress Matilda the First and her fight
Yeah.
for power.
So Empress Matilda, I mean, I'm quite fond of Empress Matilda. She's one of my favorites. I think she's really interesting. And she's in the chapter I look at kind of women who are denied the title of queen. And I mean, she's a classic example. I mean, actually, even kind of relatively modern biographies don't call her queen, and she's famous, of course, for her epitaph, which is, the daughter, wife, and I'm completely paraphrasing, it's the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry, you know, great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest by offspring, or something like that. And it's like, well, what about her? So she is, of course, the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I of England, who declares her his heir and gets everybody to swear oaths. And oaths are a big deal in the 12th century. Breaking oaths is a bad thing. So that kind of should have been enough, but unfortunately it isn't. And when Henry dies in 1135, her cousin Stephen, who, I mean, I'm not very fond of Stephen. I think it's a shame he got off the white ship early because he had a case of diarrhea. He should have stayed on it. But it sums up Stephen that's the reason he wasn't in the wreck of the white ship, I think. So I try not to be too partisan, but I'm not fond of Stephen. But yeah, so he sneaks back over the channel and has himself crowned as king. And it takes Matilda a long time to even kind of gain enough support that she can challenge that, because actually it was quite revolutionary, the idea of declaring his daughter his heir. I mean, I suspect Henry I was sort of hoping that he would live long enough that Matilda's son, the future Henry II, would be old enough that really he could rule, because it's a difficult ask getting a queen in the Anglo-Norman realm in the 12th century. But she does make a really valid attempt. She arrives in England in 1139. She's helped by her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester. He's an illegitimate son of the king, previous king. And actually, I mean, she effectively rules the West Country in England for much of Stephen's reign. So, I mean, I kind of feel it should probably be considered an almost dual monarchy at this stage. She mints her coin. She's very much has her sphere of influence. But in 1141, she actually succeeds in capturing Stephen in battle and is declared Lady of the English. It's debatable whether or not she's also called a queen, but it kind of doesn't matter because Lady of the English clearly means queen. And I think that's worth bringing out with terms, actually. Margaret I of Denmark and Sweden and Norway is another example. She's called husband of her kingdoms during her lifetime. But if that's her title, then that must mean monarch, effectively, I think. So Matilda is Lady of the English. She goes to London for her coronation and gets thrown out. And eventually sort of has to release Stephen. All of the chronicles are written by men in the period, and they're horrible to her. It's basically said, she loses the kingdom because she's very arrogant, because she has her supporters come to her on their knees. But of course, that's what monarchs do. I mean, I would imagine her grandfather, William the Conqueror, had supporters coming to him on his knees. One chronicle actually says that she loses the throne because she's a bit frowny. She wrinkles her face at people, which is, different standards for women. And I think that is really worth saying. She's accused
She
of
should
losing.
really, if only she smiled more,
Yeah, if she smiled more, it would all have been fine. Except it wouldn't, would it? I mean, she's accused of losing her throne because she frowns. I mean, her father has two of his granddaughters blinded through an illegitimate child. So that's, where the granddaughters come from. He has two of them blinded, and nobody says he's a bad king or deserves to lose his throne. But Matilda frowns, so she deserves to go away.
Yeah, and I think, too, a lot of the legacy of a lot of these women for a long time was very negative because it was men who were writing the chronicles and writing the official histories. And so, we see this time and time again, like Hatshepsut in ancient Egypt was scrubbed really from the record for a long time. I mean, she created more sort of buildings and statues than anyone had before, but her, very I think, vengeful. I don't know him personally, but it seemed pretty vengeful. Successor, like, tried to scrub her from the earth because didn't want that kind of shadow, that legacy hanging over his. And we see that time and time again. And I think, with Bloody Mary, with so many of these women, it pleases me greatly to see so many of them being re-examined and given new life, and some of the sort of negative connotations being washed away.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And that they get the posthumous recognition. I think it's important as well. I think it's important for future female rulers, including, presidents, prime ministers, but that you can see these examples of female rule, which are often denied. Again, I mean, Marguerite of Denmark's a really good example, husband of her kingdoms. When Margareta became Queen of Denmark in 1972, she said, I'm going to take the regnal number 2. And that immediately promoted Marguerite to Marguerite I. And that was a moment when she actually became a monarch in kind of people's eyes. Before that, she'd been a kind of weird regent figure, even though for much of her reign, there wasn't an other ruler. It was just her. But, actually that happened in the 1970s. And they say in Denmark, that was the day they got 2 queens because they got both Margaretas, Marguerite I and Margareta II. But it's true. But I think it's important. And it focuses people's attention. People have looked into her a lot more since that has happened because, she kind of arouses interest. But I think it is actually a much more accurate statement of what her position actually was.
Okay, so let's talk about something that I knew very little about, but you dedicated a whole chapter to it, and that is the empresses of Japan. So can you tell us a little bit about Japan's ruling women?
Yes, so this was a really interesting chapter to research, and I felt they deserved their own chapter actually, because most people don't think Japan has empresses, female emperors at least. And that's kind of a fairly standard position. And today they don't. In the 19th century, women are removed from the line of succession. So now princesses, when they marry, they lose their royal status, for example, and they have no claim to the throne. So the current emperor only has a daughter, Princess Eiko, who is an heir to the throne. And they had a succession crisis a while after she was born, actually, where they sort of realized that I think there were 6 people in line to the throne in the whole world, 6 people with a claim to the throne, and the average age was 59. So they came very close to bringing women back into the line of succession before the current emperor's brother actually produced a son. So they sort of slightly kicked the can down the road. But it's fascinating because Japan has had reigning empresses. I think because of the changes in the succession in recent centuries, people tend to look at them as regents now. They're sort of keeping the throne warm for a male successor, but it's not really true when you look at the histories of them. First, they've had 8 reigning empresses. The first is Suiko, who reigns in the 6th century. And actually, in the period 6th to 8th century, half of Japan's rulers are female, which is unprecedented. Suiko reigns for over 30 years. She's a very independent ruler. She promotes Buddhism extensively. She also promotes literature in Japanese. It's the first period where we get Japanese writing effectively. Before that, works have been written in Chinese. So, that's really interesting. She also opens up diplomatic relations with China. She's the first person to use the title of Tenno that we know of, which is the title for emperor, which the current emperor, of course, also uses. So she's really important. And there's a whole series of really interesting empresses in that period. There's 6 in that period, and 2 actually reigned twice under different regnal names, which is a little confusing because all of the names are posthumous names. So in the book, I've tried to use the names by which people were known during their lifetime. But in Japan, I've made an exception. I've used their posthumous names because actually that's how they're known. All of Japan's reigning emperors and empresses are given a posthumous name, which is what they're known as. Suiko's means conjecture of history because it's about the fact that people are writing history for the first time in her reign. But there are some really interesting examples. There's actually an example of female to female succession in this period when Empress Genmei abdicates the throne for her daughter, Genshu. Abdication in Japan is very common. And I think it's often mistaken as and it's kind of an admission it's an impermanent reign, for example, particularly in the case of women. Genmei abdicates for her daughter, then Genshu abdicates for her nephew. But actually, there's a case of an emperor abdicating for his daughter, for example. And actually, abdicated emperors in Japan often retain quite significant power in any respects. And certainly some of the abdicated female sovereigns do. Jito is a really good example of a very, very powerful empress, both during her reign and after she abdicates. But so there are these really interesting examples of reigning women. Empress Koken, who leaves the throne and then comes back as Empress Shotoku, is quite a controversial figure in the 8th century. She had a relation. She's actually a Buddhist nun. She entered a convent during her interregnum, and then she's the only example of a reigning nun in Japan, which does cause some constitutional issues. She also has a priest that she's very fond of called Dokyo, who is probably her lover and is very controversial. And actually after that, there's a long period where they don't have a reigning empress, and it's usually pinned on Koken Shotoku, and it's sort of said, it's because she was terrible. But she wasn't really. She's actually... A few exhibitions, at least in Britain recently, have showcased these little pagodas that have printed Buddhist spells inside. And she created these, and she ordered that 1 million of these pagodas be sent around Japan as kind of a mark of her Buddhist faith, which is fascinating in itself. But there's a long period where there aren't female empresses, but they do have one in the 17th century, and they also have one in the 18th century. So it's not just a kind of early medieval thing either. But now there aren't. There's a real sense that these women weren't truly rulers in some sense because of the fact that Japan doesn't have a reigning empress today, and possibly, they probably will have a reigning empress, I would think, by the end of the century, because, they don't have many branches to their family tree, at least at the moment. But it's fascinating that you do get these powerful women. And they're also, what's actually interesting about them is they weren't alone. Japan wasn't an anomaly. China has Wu Zexin. She overlaps with some of these women. And the Kingdom of Silla in Korea, also, they have 2 reigning queens in this period as well who overlap. So, there is a real sense of kind of feminine rule in the region as well.
Fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know anything about any of them. And someone else, one of your lesser known subjects that I did not know anything about, her name is Cora Gooseberry of Sydney. And I would love it if you would tell us about Cora.
Yeah, so Cora is quite a sad example, actually. She's very much an example of constructed queenship. So I actually came upon her story. I was in Sydney and went to the Rocks Museum, which is this fascinating museum about the history of Sydney. And they had one of her breastplates, which is kind of a half moon-shaped metal plate that's stamped on it. Cora Gooseberry, Freeman Bungaree, Queen of Sydney and Botany Bay. And effectively what the British did in the 18th century is they attempted dialogues with the Aboriginal communities of Sydney and surrounding areas of New South Wales. And they attempted to do this by kind of almost crowning, effectively, people that they considered to be leaders of the community. And they do this with the breastplates, where they would, have a ceremony and they would give them the breastplates. And people would often wear them quite proudly. But, it's very much within a colonial context. And, actually, Cora Gooseberry, she's probably called Carew. We're not totally sure of her original name, but she's always called Cora Gooseberry or Queen Gooseberry in the period. And she's very much kind of created as this community leader. And I think to some extent, really to her cost. And it's a really interesting relationship because the British there are Russian settlers as well, recognize her queenship. So they will talk about her, as a queen. And kind of there is a recognition, but they're also fairly horrible. And, you can see all the racism writ large as well in the way they respond to these members of the Aboriginal community who've been created as leaders. So it's quite a sad story. And of course, her whole life changed. She would have been a young adult, perhaps a teenager, when the first fleet sailed into Sydney Harbour. And her whole life changes. But she's also not entirely powerless because I think, her status does give her some level of power as well. So she's a really interesting character. And I was so pleased to be able to include her in the book because she's an example of a life very much changed by the colonialism of the 18th and 19th centuries. But there is some level of power as well in what we know about her. But again, we're seeing her through other people's eyes. She's left no written documents herself. Her community from that period at least have got no written documents. And in general, it's quite a sad story, but also I think there is some level of kind of empowerment in the way that she retains her sense of self and her sense of individuality and her cohesion within her community.
I have one more question for you. I am wondering if you could travel back in time and you could meet with any of these women who you write about in your book and just ask her questions, have a conversation, who would it be?
That's always difficult because there's so many interesting ones. I mean, from a Tudor history perspective, I kind of want to go and chat to Elizabeth I and get the real lowdown. And Catherine the Great. I mean, how you go from being minor German princess to ruler of all Russia, that's quite impressive. I usually say Tamar of Georgia, and I think I'm going to stick with Tamar of Georgia because I think she's fascinating and should be better known. She's incredibly well known in Georgia. She's on the banknotes. So this is Georgia in the Caucasus, of course, sort of south of Russia. She's on all the banknotes there. She's on the postage stamp. She's incredibly revered in Georgia, but almost nobody's heard of her over here, in the rest of Europe. She reigns from 1184 to 1213. She's initially crowned to rule alongside her father, effectively like Henry I getting the oath for Matilda. He's basically crowning Tamar in his lifetime in the hope that that will be enough to keep her on the throne after his death. And he's quite scary. So people go along with it while he's alive. But when she becomes queen in her own right, it starts off as a real disaster. She struggles immensely to impose her authority, which is almost entirely due to her sex. Her ministers kind of overrule her. She has almost kind of a Magna Carta moment. And before the Magna Carta actually happens, where she's forced to accept, effectively the creation of a parliament. She says it will be the end of my rule and is able to push back to some extent, but it's, she's in a very powerless situation. She's forced to marry a prince that they send for from Russia, who nobody really knows anything about and turns out to be a bit of a disaster. And it's only really through years of hard work and politicking and, kind of building up her position that she's able to become a real strength. She's able to choose her own council. She's able to take back power. She's able to divorce her husband and send him back to Russia. And she's remembered now in Georgia for presiding over an absolute golden age. She's seen as a real icon of Georgian history. It's when Georgia reaches its greatest territorial extent. She sees off invaders, for example, and it's the period before the Mongol conquest of Georgia. So it's kind of almost the last moment where Georgia is prosperous for a very long time. But what I like about her is where she came from. She's almost kind of the story of reigning queens writ large, all in that one lifetime. They often become revered. They often become remembered. They tend to be very visible. But they start from difficult positions and anything that they have is almost always hard won. And I think that's why I like Tamar so much. I think she's fascinating.
Well, Elizabeth, your book, When Women Ruled the World, is fascinating. I love how you've structured it. I think that you're bringing such interesting women into our lives and into conversation with each other. And listeners, I know that you're going to love it. So go and pick up a copy. And thank you so much for joining us again, Elizabeth. It's a delight to have you on the show again.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Thanks so much to Elizabeth for joining us. You can buy a copy of Women Who Ruled the World wherever good books are sold, and through the Exploress bookshop. Buying there benefits an indie bookstore, and I get a little kickback as well, which you'll find a link to in the show notes and on my website. Thanks to Carly Quinn for all her help with the show, to Mr. Exploress for my logo, and to Joshua Stackhouse for my theme music. Until next time.